because I wanted to take a segue into the 3 marks of existence. And some of you who have been coming to the Wednesday night group for the past year might have heard Roy and I talk a lot about this because it was about a year ago that we did a deep dive into all 3 marks of existence. We took 3 months and we took a month on each one. But I realized we never just did an overview. We never just talked about them as a whole. And something was kind of on my heart today to just bring these up as a reminder. So that's what we're talking about, is the 3 marks of existence, which we'll go into more deeply. But the reason that I brought this up, and one of the things I want you to reflect on right now, is how do you know you're human? How do you know you're human? What is your perception of humanity? Everybody just think about it for a moment. What is the consistency through human experience? It's funny, it actually came to mind because I was beat bopping in my house, like playing songs in my head. And one of the songs that came to mind is there's a song by Jason Isbell. It's like, I'm a white man living on a white man's street. It's like this all like a really cool like social justice song. And he says something about, at the very end of the chorus, he says, we're all carrying one great burden, sharing one fate. And it made me think of like, oh, dang. Yeah, that's Dharma. This is the curse. If you start to come to meditation more often, you're going to see that everywhere. Dharma being just the teachings of the Buddha, right? It's everywhere. So I was, kind of listening to that, and it made me think about these marks of existence and how they're something that we all share. Every single one of us, regardless of how we were raised, where we come from, our personal experience, our personal struggles, right? We all deal with these 3 marks of existence. And so we're going to talk about what are the 3 marks of existence. We'll do a deep-ish dive on each one of them, and then talk about how do we work with them? Like, what do we do? So I guess I'll just start by this. By show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the 3 marks of existence? How many of you are familiar with it? How many of you are like, kind of know what it is, but don't really know? How many of you are like, what is that? Sick. Nice. Not everyone voted. So we'll start with this. I'm going to use some terms. They're Pali-Sanskrit terms, which is believed to be the language of the Buddha, right? And here at Wild Heart, we all kind of run in this lineage of Theravadan Buddhism. But I'm going to just say this as a disclaimer. You do not have to be a Buddhist to find some value in these teachings, right? So even though we're using kind of the Buddhist-y words, I don't want you to feel like, oh no, I'm not a Buddhist, I can't be here. You can be here. We're glad you're here. Stick around. So the 3 marks of existence. The first one, dukkha. Dukkha is the Pali-Sanskrit word, and we'll go into more of what that means, the etymology of it, all that stuff. But basically, all dukkha means is that life is imperfect. Have you noticed that it's hard to be a human? Have you noticed that there is this basic underlying quality of unsatisfactoriness that kind of just weaves itself all through life? I know you have, because you wouldn't be here if you hadn't. We don't come here because things are going good. Most of the time we show up here out of what we call the gift of desperation. So dukkha. It do be like that sometimes, right? Things are hard. Anicca is the next one. Life at the root is impermanent. All things are constantly changing. Self-explanatory. Have you noticed that? Things are different. Things change all the time. Like that line in that song, we all share the same fate, that life is at the root impermanent. And we spend so much of our life trying to get away from that mark of existence. We don't want to believe that things are impermanent. And then the last one can be a little bit of a doozy, but bear with me. The last one is called anatta. It's the Pali Sanskrit word. And most of the time, it's kind of translated to life at the root is impersonal. There is no concrete or fixed self, which can be a little bit tough, and we'll go into more about all the things. We'll talk a little bit about it. So dukkha, anicca, and anatta, imperfect, impermanent, impersonal. And these are all true, and they give rise to each other. We'll talk a little bit about how that happens. But do you notice that most of the time when dukkha is present, when there's imperfection present, there's also maybe impermanence is around. Or maybe this idea that it's personal shows up. Right? Most of the time these things are connected. Where one is, there's probably the others. But the thing that's nice about seeing that these are just the marks of being a human, these are the marks of humanity, the nice thing about this is we realize that there's nothing to fix. A lot of times we come to spiritual or, I'll call it spiritual. We come to spiritual practices out of this gift of desperation, right? Out of this need to fix, right? I meditate so that I can fix my mind. I show up on a Wednesday night so that I don't feel so shitty, because I need to fix how I feel. Not to say that it doesn't help, right? Certainly. But this is sometimes my beef with other spiritual practices. There's this idea that somewhere deep down, if we just get it right, then we'll be happy. And everything will be great. And I won't be sad anymore, right? But what this tells us is that that's not true. No matter what we do, no matter what meditations we show up to, no matter what books we read, no matter what person we meet, no matter what job we get, no matter what car we drive, there will always be these marks. The car is going to break down. Impermanent. I'm going to age. Impermanent. I'm going to struggle with money. Impersonal and imperfect. Right? These are just the facts of life. And so it's good news. Isn't it nice? We don't have to fix anything. We can just be like, oh, it do be like that. Now, there are ways we can work with these things, but the idea is we're not here to fight them. And so many other spiritual practices, it's about getting rid of it. Our practice is to be like, we can't get rid of it, so we might as well work with it. That's why we're here. So we'll start with dukkha. I want to go a little deeper into each one of these. Dukkha, fun word to say. Fun word to say. Dukkha. It's oftentimes translated as suffering, which I don't love. Don't really love that translation. For a couple of reasons, right? Because there's something that I believe very firmly, and that is pain is inevitable, suffering is not. Right? And so suffering as the end-all be-all like translation of dukkha doesn't really work for me personally. Instead, I like to think of dukkha as the actual translation. So when we go way back, way back to the time of the Buddha, when we're talking about Pali Sanskrit, Instead of cars, they had ox and carts, right? Like those sorts of things. You can picture that, right? Like a big old, some ox and then a cart. So when you had an ox cart, you still had an axle and a wheel, right? But this word dukkha comes from essentially the idea that the wheel is not set correctly, right? So dukkha is this, like there's space in between the axle and the wheel. So it makes the cart funky. The modern day equivalent, which some of you have heard, is the squeaky wheel shopping cart, right? You ever get that shopping cart where one wheel just like won't go and it's annoying? That's dukkha. That is dukkha. We like to think of suffering as this big thing. Dukkha is insidious. Dukkha is there all the time. Is your life ever like a squeaky shopping cart wheel? Yes. Right? So that's the literal translation of dukkha. So we can think about it as suffering, but it's much deeper than that. And the cool thing about dukkha is this is the first noble truth. When we talk about Buddhism, right, the first sermon the Buddha ever gave after his enlightenment talks about the Four Noble Truths. And the first noble truth is that there is suffering, there is difficulty, there is dukkha, right? And he explains that dukkha is birth, aging, sickness, death, being separated from what we hold dear. Essentially, not having what we do want and having what we don't want, right? This is dukkha. And we learn, because the first noble truth, that is just, it do be like that. Exactly. That should be the name of this talk. It do be like that. Because it's just true. That's why they call it the first noble truth. And there's a couple different kinds of dukkha. I find that, like, I feel like, do y'all love personality tests? I feel like a lot of people who are into spiritual stuff like that, like the Myers-Briggs and the Enneagram and like all that stuff. Well, in Buddhism, there's some personality types too. And I find that there's a specific type of person that gravitates to each one of these kinds of dukkha. So I'm going to explain these 3 types of dukkha, and there's more types as well, but these are the 3 biggies. And I want you to see if any of these resonate with you more than the others. So the first type of dukkha is called dukkha dukkha. really just like dukkha dukkha, the shit of the shit. And this is suffering from suffering. This is physical and mental pain, right? Being of the nature to age, to get sick and die. Shit happens, right? Dukkha dukkha shows up for me when I get migraines. I get really, really awful migraines to the point where, like, I lose my speech and I, like, go numb on one side and I puke for, like, 12 hours. And this practice has been so nice because while I'm, like, laying on the bathroom floor, like, just so, just obliterated by this migraine, I can just be like, this dukkha is present. Suffering is present. So that's dukkha dukkha. This is just like, and that doesn't mean that it turns into a pleasant thing. No, it sucks. It sucks. But that's dukkha dukkha, right? Just the inevitable parts of life. Then there's viparinama dukkha, which is interesting. This is the frustration of a pleasant thing turning into unpleasant, right? When causes and conditions change and we experience anicca, or impermanence. The way I like to say it, it's like when you're on vacation and you spend your whole last day upset about the fact that it's about to be over, right? Like going to Disney World and then being like, oh, I wish I had more time at Disney World. This happens to my wife and I all the time. I like to build Legos. Some of y'all know this. I just bought a Millennium Falcon, not the big one, but like a smaller version of the Millennium Falcon. And while we're sitting building Legos, my wife and I'm like, man, I wish we built Legos more. Right? You know, like that's viparinama dukkha. So we've got dukkha dukkha, viparinama dukkha, and then we've got sankhara dukkha. This one is like, get ready, buckle up. Sankhara dukkha is a step beyond pain. This is why I say pain is inevitable, suffering is not. This is the mental formations that we come up with that cause us pain and suffering. Some of us will call it the second arrow. It's this idea of like, okay, I get a migraine, right? I have dukkha dukkha. And I say to myself, man, like, I wish I could just afford to have like the cool procedure done where I don't have to do this, or like, I guess I just suck and like I'm being punished or whatever. It's like all these mental formations that come along with the suffering or with the dukkha, right? As we start to notice aging, right? Oh my gosh, like the other day I was looking in the mirror and I have these lines right here because I constantly furrow my brow like all the time. And I started to think, I was like, oh my gosh, what can I do to get rid of these lines? Like I need to be better about mental formations, right? Instead of just being like, oh yeah, aging. My body is aging. So yeah, those are the types of dukkha. Okay, who resonates with the dukkha dukkha, just like pain as it is? Okay, anybody got that type? All right. What about viparinama dukkha? Yeah, a couple of those. And what about sankhara dukkha? Yeah, it do be like that sometimes. So let's bring it over to anicca, or impermanence. Roy, who facilitates with me on Wednesday nights sometimes, is really good at like breaking apart words. So I literally copied something he said. And what he says about the breaking apart the word anicca, or impermanence, A means not, right? And as in like theist versus atheist, right? Like atheist is not theist. So anicca means not Nietzsche. So Nietzsche means constant, continuous, or permanent. Nothing stays the same, everything changes. Okay, so Nietzsche, not constant, not continuous, not permanent. The mark of existence. Beyond that, it kind of connects with this idea of no self or no fixed self, because there's no fixed nature of anything, because everything's always changing, right? Just when I feel like I get to know who I am, I change. Impermanence can kind of suck sometimes, but other times it can also be kind of nice, right? Because sometimes when I have those bad migraines, I know it's not going to last forever, right? So don't trick yourself into thinking that these marks of existence are all bad news or unpleasant, because that's not always true. Impermanence is something that I would love to sit and talk to you about for however long, but I don't need to. I don't need to, because you have all experienced impermanence. If I asked you in your head, in your mind right now, think of something, some time that you've experienced impermanence. You're not going to have any trouble, right? Could be the cookie dough ice cream going away, right? It could be the loss of a loved one or a pet. There's plenty of places that impermanence shows up, and you don't need me to sit here and tell you that. Just look at your own experience. It's my favorite part about Buddhism is like, be a light for yourself. Ehipassiko is what we call it. Impermanence is, however, deeply connected to the other marks of existence. And the way that they're connected reminds us again that it's not a problem. These marks of existence are not a problem. They're just the facts of life. They're baked into what we experience on a day-to-day. another way that I always get hesitant to share personal stories with y'all because I don't want to just make it all about me, but how these are connected, right? So let's talk about how anicca and anatta, which is what we're going to talk about next, are connected. The body is subject to impermanence, right? We all agree. The body is subject to impermanence. And our experience of ourself is all rooted in the body and its functions. See what we're saying? Right? Our experience of who Maddie is rooted in something that is impermanent. My body. My mind, impermanent. Conditioning and how it stores and expresses information is obtained by our experience in this body, which is impermanent. So sometimes we can automatically see it as bad because we're hardwired for survival, right? But not having a permanent self, or leaning into the fact that the self we have constructed in this moment is not going to be this way even 5 minutes from now, allows us to grow and learn and heal. Again, not all bad news. So my personal example, some of you have heard me talk about this. In 2018, I got headhunted for American Idol, and I was asked by a casting producer to go and audition. I didn't have to wait in the big line. I just got to go and sing for the judges. It was cool, right? And I actually made it fairly far. I got all the way to Hollywood Week, which is a bitch. It's the worst. And I got up to the very end of Hollywood Week, and I got cut. But how they do it is just so mean. They put everybody in these rooms, right? So they divvy everybody up into rooms, and there's 3 rooms. 2 rooms of people don't make it, and they go home, and 1 room of people make it. And so as soon as you get in that room, you know if you're staying or you're going home. Because if the heavy hitters aren't in there, you're out. Right? So you're just like, all right, I knew the second that I got into my room, okay, I'm going home. Right? And the reason I got cut, right? So I come from pop punk. I have a history of aggressive singing. I'm pretty good at it. Can sing very loud and very high and very angry. And that's what I brought in with me everywhere, was the style of singing that was aggressive, that was angry. It was built to impress, right? And as a vocal coach, I see this all the time. I see people do things that are built to impress, right? Whether it's riffs or whatever. So when I got cut, my identity in itself was in question. Because what Katy Perry said to me was, you have this cool, angsty, sexy thing about you, but you don't need to prove it every time you sing. So the very thing that had always been my way to impress was the reason I got cut. Right? And so my identity now, that's wrapped up in this style of singing, is gone. Right? It's vulnerable. And so seeing the impermanence of my technique, right, myself, I was able to take that criticism, that critique, and learn how to grow into a more effective vocalist. So it's not all bad, this idea of an impermanent self. If I didn't allow myself to be impermanent, I would have never grown into the artist I am now. Right? I would still be too busy trying to impress by singing very loud and very high all the time. Does that make sense? Yeah. And in the same way, anicca is also connected, this impermanence is also connected to dukkha. It reminds us that unpleasantness and difficult we experience is also subject to impermanence, right? So again, not bad news. Sometimes the reminder can feel a little dismissive, right? Without wisdom and mindfulness, it can even kind of get into weird spiritual bypass land. So that's something to be cognizant of. Because we say to ourselves, like, if a friend comes to us saying, like, man, I had a really hard day, or like, this was really tough. You ever have those friends that are like, oh, well, it is what it is. That's life. How dismissive does that sound? Right? Or like, oh, just go for a walk. Just go for a walk. It'll get better. It'll get better. It's dismissive. So we have to just be a little cautious as we start to think about impermanence with dukkha. So we have to have wisdom when we think about this. So instead of just seeing that we're experiencing some dukkha and then knowing, okay, at least it's going to be done. Right? Instead of just bypassing like that, can we put some trust into this truth that allows us this window to see our suffering and pain through the lens of curiosity without dismissing it? Because if we dismiss it, there's no room for compassion. And compassion is the good, right? Just like I was saying earlier, compassion is loving kindness towards pain. And if we bypass our pain, we have no room for compassion. And if we have no room for our self-compassion, we have no room to have compassion for others, right? So the fact that our suffering is impermanent is good news, but we also don't want to just dismiss it. We can use it as a tool to comfort and to nurture, almost as a tool of compassion, right? Another personal story. I have a twee bit, just a twee bit of religious trauma. Can I get a woot woot for that? Woot woot. Yeah, that's why we end up here. Unpleasant. And so my wife's family is fairly religious in the evangelical world. They're so kind and lovely, and it brings up opportunities for me to see where religious people are right. And by that, I mean there's family functions where we go to church. And that can be really, really hard for me. So one of the examples I have here is we have a 1.5-year-old niece who is just the bee's knees. She's awesome. And she was baptized, right? And I'm not going to miss that, right? So I was, my wife and I talked about it. I'm like, I'm good. I got this. So we go to the church, and they have this baptism, and I just start crying, like sobbing, like panic attack. And so in that moment, I had to be aware that dukkha was present, right? But also know that this is happening now, and seeing it through this lens of anicca, that it will continue to arise and pass away. I can be there in the middle of this reaction, this reactivity that I can't necessarily control. And I can find solace in the fact that it's going to be over, but in that moment, there's nothing I could do, right? Except be kind and compassionate to my own experience. To be kind and gentle with my experience. And sometimes that's reminding myself that it is impermanent. And when I reminded myself that it was impermanent, did my panic attack go away? No. But I was able to care for myself in the way that I knew how, which was to be compassionate. Does that make sense? So lastly, anatta. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this because it can be a little bit hefty. And I'll start by just saying this briefly. There's a story about the Buddha. Once the Buddha was walking through the forest with a group of monks, Then he stooped down to pick up a handful of leaves and told the monks that the leaves in his hands were like the teachings he had given. As for the leaves in the forest, they were like the knowledge he had gained from his awakening. And the leaves in his hand covered just two issues: how suffering is caused and how it can be ended. So what he's saying by that is all you need is suffering and its end. Right? This idea of non-self and some of these bigger concepts. Don't worry about it. Okay? It's good to be aware, but you don't need to hold on to it and be like, I don't understand not self. I need to never go back there, right? So just like the Buddha himself was like, you're good. It's okay to not understand this, right? So keeping that in mind as we talk about this. So the definition of anatta, technically the word is translated as no soul or no self. And using the Pali term helps us kind of see it as a less rigid view, right? Because it really is not rigid. It's not when we think of no self, it's like this direct attack on everything we've built. Because again, we build who we are based on this impermanent causes and conditions of the body. And the Buddha taught this as a more advanced concept. While it is part of the three marks, it doesn't show up in the Four Noble Truths, it doesn't show up in the Eightfold Path. That doesn't mean it's not important. It's just commonly, it's got a lot of common misconceptions with it. So I like to just reiterate those points. And I think it's easier to think about what is not anatta, what is not impersonal or non-self, more than it is what is. So what is not anatta? It's funny because the Buddha was not answering the question, is there a self or is there not a self? Right? A lot of folks will come in here and they'll be like, okay, am I real? Right? Or am I not real? Right? And the Buddha intentionally did not answer this question. He says in the suttas, do I have a self? What am I? Do I exist? Do I not exist? The Buddha listed all of these questions as unskillful questions. So that's not what we're saying here. We're not saying I'm real, I'm not real. It's not this black and white. And the more you come into the meditation spaces and Dharma, you'll see everything's gray. Everything's real gray. Really what anatta is it's a skillful and an unskillful perspective of self, right? The question he's really answering is, what, when I do it, will lead to long-term welfare and happiness, right? We see time and time again that the sense of self is important to practice. And this teaching of non-self is just a way to understand when the perception of self or non-self is skillful or unskillful, right? Again, handful of leaves. Just remember, handful of leaves. One way this shows up is selfing, right? It's this idea of have y'all, when I say selfing, does that make sense? I have a lot of people ask me what selfing means. Okay. Selfing, in my opinion, means for instance, literally I just had therapy today. This is something I could talk about. So my wife and I came from very different financial backgrounds. I grew up in a trailer. She grew up in Brentwood. Very different, right? And because of that, I have a lot of debt, and she has no debt. She, in fact, has savings. What's that? So in my therapy appointment today, we were talking about how I feel this guilt. Because now that we're married, my debt is her debt. And she didn't sign up for that. I mean, she kind of did when she married me. But it's this selfing. It's this okay, our entire financial situation is my fault. Me. I. It's this for lack of a better word, ego. Remember, ego goes both ways. I'm the best, I'm the worst. I'm so great, I really suck. And the one consistent thing we see with all of it is I. I. When we come to anatta, we start to question, is this I, the way I'm seeing it, skillful? Okay. Other ways is just, am I taking things personally? Right? We boil it down. I'm taking our financial situation personally. And there's no fixed self that has, does that make any sense? I know it can be a little bit tough. Good, yeah, so.
It's also like, I mean, everyone has a relationship with money, so like you're coming in with like, you have like, you know, your own stuff with money, so it's like a big thing to you, where somebody that grew up with money, like, if she got debt, like to her, it probably wouldn't be a big deal. Like,
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Like, I just know how to get out of this.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
how you were, you know, whatever your upbringing was, it's all about how we perceive it based on our.
Yeah, exactly. And so we have to decide, is this I've cultivated skillful or unskillful? And so, imperfect, impermanent, impersonal. 3 marks of existence. I want to make sure we get to discussion, so I'm going to keep this last section very brief. And this is, how do we work with it? Okay, again, we're not here to get rid of these marks, we're just here to work with it. And it's kind of, I think, a one-size-fits-all. We have these 2 wings of awakening, and they are wisdom and compassion. And so we want to have a balanced practice of seeing clearly and responding wisely. And that's literally it. That's how we work with these things. We see clearly the nature that life is imperfect, impersonal, and impermanent, and we respond wisely to that fact. That's all it is.
What's up, y'all? Reverend Mikey Noshel here from Wild Heart Meditation Center in Nashville, Tennessee. Thanks for checking us out. Do me a favor, please like and subscribe. And if you feel moved to leave a donation, you can do so at wildheartmeditationcenter.org or the Venmo link in the description. Peace and love.